everyone. Welcome back to Built to Last. Today's topic is going to be something that I think every founder, every leader, every CEO wrestles with, but no one really talks about, which is your own background, how you came into this position, some of the things that you saw early on in your career, and how that impacts the way that you choose to operate your company. Not necessarily just strategy, but also things that you've learned in your experience that leads to some gut instincts for how you want to operate. So, with that also comes different blind spots because not everyone is completely skilled in every single field. So, there's going to be some things that you may rely on other leaders within your company on, or some things that you go out of your way to educate yourself in. And I wanted to talk about things that are blind spots for you guys individually, and then also any systems that you guys build to catch those different blind spots. So, as usual, I got Jen from UserVoice, I got Nick from Convox, I have Jess from Polymer, and I have Srey from Avenue. I'll let them start for whoever wants to kick us off first.
Sure, Shelley. I'll go. So my background is really I came up as a classical Cisco network engineer. I worked at ISP and did technical support and delivery and worked in their data centers and eventually moved on to more of an enterprise delivery firm, doing everything from rack and stack to architectural planning. Was shifting towards cloud and got picked up by Convox to be our initial chief architect, helping to design the V2 and V3 rack systems. And when we got acquired, I moved up to GM and then on to CEO. So I'd say, generally speaking, I have much more of an engineering mindset than anything else because that's really the path that I came up through. And here we are today trying to do everything from marketing, sales to front end design, along with my architecting in the cloud.
I think your engineering background always comes through in your responses, which I love. Jen, what about you?
I think the only constant in my background is that I get curious about different things. I had originally gone to school thinking I was going to go into chemical engineering, did not want to do that anymore, and then switched into graphic design, but kept a math minor just for fun. And then went off into the career world and ended up landing at an advertising agency right after everyone was coming back from the dot-com bust. So it was an interesting time for people who like to tinker around and do a lot of stuff. So I was technically hired in as a designer, but I never really just did design. I ended up doing a lot of product work. The agency was RGA, so they were like trialing this kind of model of doing more like product service work for customers. And so I ended up working on Verizon Wireless, of all things, like original proprietary mobile interfaces. And everything was like an individual tiny asset. There were like giant printed technical manuals we would have to give to engineers, not the way it is today. But so I was doing design, but I was also really deep in the technical specs and I was very close to the business side of things. So I ended up in this place just by happenstance of the time and the zeitgeist in tech and advertising at the time that I was like getting a piece of everything, and that led me to join startups. I moved over in a capacity as a UX designer and UX leader, and then I started taking over overseeing product teams as well. I think that whole sort of like systematic lifestyle of what we're making, why we're making it, and then keeping that kind of like human-centered notion to what we're making in tech, in these products, in these businesses, whether it's B2B, consumer, whatever, you're solving some kind of communication problem between people and information or people and people. So I think that mindset and that sort of like training from years ago is something that I think is an asset that I keep with me. But I think it also is like the thing where I never like to stay in one spot at a time. I've worked in a lot of different kinds of companies, from ed tech to e-commerce to media to all of that, because I like to keep unpacking and understanding why certain businesses run a certain way or certain products or things like that. So I think one makes me feel like I am not afraid to be curious or ask questions or be bad at something or fail at it, because I rely on my sort of like instinct around being able to pick apart a system at a high level and kind of understand it. I think where the blind spots start to come in, though, are the real squishy human parts. Like being on a sales call is my worst nightmare on this earth. I'm also really terrible at actual like public self-promotion. I had to really like work toward doing speaking events and things like that over time in my career because I think that's the part that feels harder. So one of the challenges I'm setting for myself at UserVoice is beginning to think about how I do more of that and be more of the face of the business externally without wanting to die. So I think those are the pieces, but I've done a lot of things and I like to keep learning new things. And that's like the gist of the way I have bumbled my way through my career so far.
I don't think you've bumbled. And I think that already with this podcast, you've gone out of your way to work on some thought leadership.
Yeah,
You've
I'm
already
growing.
started. Jess, I'd love to hear a little bit more about you.
I am also have a varied background. I thought I was going to do computer science, and I got to college and I saw all the guys with all their hardware and chickened out. Like I was the only girl there. Anyway, so I ended up doing a math minor and a history degree. I was going to say I also had a math
Yes,
minor for fun.
that's right. Just for funsies.
Oh,
I was
math
like,
minors for fun is a
math
crazy
minor for fun.
concept.
The last class I ever took was on imaginary numbers. Anyway, sorry, Jess.
Anyway, coming out of that, I did a few things. Including teaching mathematics to high schoolers and working as a legal assistant for many years. But I did a career switch in 2019 and I started learning coding. Did one of those famous boot camps that were so popular at the time. And from there, I worked for the boot camp actually for a while in their labs. But from there, I started to work at Polymer, which is where I still am today. I came in, the founders were getting it running, and I did a lot of QA, quality assurance engineering to begin with. Didn't really have time to do that themselves and started doing things that were more and more coding, obviously, and just working on that throughout and sort of progressed. I became the first sole employee and I ended up taking on other things, including customer service. And of course, they wanted me to do a bit of marketing. And then by the time the company was acquired, I was doing most of the things. So I ended up becoming CEO after it was acquired. And that's where I am right now. Like Nick, I still have an engineering, though, mindset. And I think it's shown, though, also with my background, that I did tend to lean more towards concrete things, like things that could give me concrete results. You wouldn't think that about a history major, but I was super strict about getting my primary sources in place and having each citation exactly and marking all my evidence. So I tend to prefer levers in my company that have visible results. Talking to a customer has visible results, and engineering has visible results, product design. However, that, of course, leads me to blind spots. I am not also great at the sales. I have done several demos. However, I wouldn't say it's my worst nightmare, but it's not my favorite thing to do. And marketing just feels a little bit like gambling to me. I think I have to, it's not just that it's not a strong point, it just doesn't feel natural lever to pull because it just doesn't have as concrete, it takes a while to see results and it just doesn't feel as natural. So that's definitely a part that I've been working on and will continue to work on, but that's definitely a blind spot. But overall, it sounds like similar to Jen and Nick. It sounds like we all come from a varied background.
Really excited to hear about you.
My starting point is in data analytics. I was the only person in my graduating class in college who had a minor in stats because we didn't have a major. The stats minor was part of the math department. I said, no, they're totally different things. Like they have maybe some core relationship, but I would say statistics and math are as
You have
different
a
as
bunch of math
economics. And
minors here.
I did get invited to 20 years later, the school, I went to Wake Forest University. They finally opened a statistics department a few years ago. All my complaining and being annoying finally paid off for whoever's in that department now. So anyway, so I did several years of analytics, which eventually took me into like marketing analytics, and that brought me to the marketing world. So I started most of that stuff in more of an e-commerce space, and then that, not by any intention, took me into subscription e-commerce in marketing, which then took me into kind of SMB SaaS. So almost like inching my way away from e-commerce into SaaS. And I've been in SMB vertical SaaS over the last 10 years or so. So that's my passion in life is vertical SMB SaaS. I was CMO at a few SaaS companies, but then over time I realized I really enjoy kind of finance. At my last organization, I was running finance as well as marketing and eventually became COO and was running a bunch of functions. But I think that what I realized was maybe because my background is more on the data side, even when I was running marketing organizations, I was running it from a financial model standpoint. So I'm kind of like a LTV purist where I like looking at your customers and who has the best LTV and working backwards from that, which I think often gets you to make responsible decisions and have good focus on the right customer, but also I think can let you be waiting around for data and be a little more risk averse depending on the stage of the company and what the challenges are. I think there's a time for different approaches. So I think that can be a little bit of, for me personally, of like energy to like, all right, even though maybe there's all this evidence in the past that says this is the right approach. If you're trying to predict the future, which you don't have any data on, then this is going to happen. Therefore, maybe you need to take a different approach or make a different decision than what the past would suggest. I think that's where I'm always trying to intentionally think about like, all right, we have to blend those two and be pragmatic.
Sure, you mentioned that your minor was in statistics. What was your major in?
Oh no, I did. I majored in economics.
Economics.
Yeah.
Super interesting. Like Nick, you are like you've always been like incredibly had an engineering mindset, and then the other three CEOs here have had math minors. Lend to some level of being analytical. Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say I didn't realize that Jen was gonna take us that far back in the hot tub. So I didn't get to go back to my actual origin story here, but I initially was and I guess I graduated with a molecular and microbiology major, and I'm a chemistry minor. So I was destined for medical school and actually was in medical school for a couple of years before I left and went back to tech. But I accidentally fell into tech early on when EMR, electronic medical records, were starting to become a thing. And I found a a very simple solution that small offices could incorporate to get HIPAA compliant infrastructure as these things were starting to become regularly enforced and the major players were doing like five-figure bids, and I could do these things for very low cost, but to an 18-year-old collecting a handful of cash was like I thought I was the next Bill Gates. So I basically didn't do any real school until I was like 23 because I was running this company that tangented off into some other things, and then I got a reasonable exit that I could just get out with at 23 and then went back to school. So I went and got my biology degree, went to medical school for 2 years. About towards the end of my didactics, which is when you were getting into your clinical rotations, realized that was just not for me. Or so the actual practicing of medicine and like the running the business side of it was just like I I had a very picturesque and I'd say Hollywood view of what being a doctor was going to be like, and I really ultimately just like the science. Like I think there's plenty of timelines where I'm a chemistry major trying to do pharmaceuticals somewhere, but I did enough research with chemistry professors and they honestly all seemed like miserable people because and one of them honestly told me this. I won't say his name, but he was like, you have to realize everyone here is miserable because we all have things we want to research, but we have to research what people give us money to research. I was like, that makes sense. So it's one of those things where I deterred from chemistry at that point because I just didn't want to be miserable and they all seemed miserable.
Yeah, that's
So
the
that's how I ended up back into tech. And then we'd say Cisco path up to where I'm at now.
that's interesting, Nick. I feel like there's a similar origin story. I had a year and a half of a chemical engineering degree, and I went to a career fair. We both went to University of Florida, so it was like gigantic career fair. And I went in, and all these booths were about like creating a new flavor of dust for Doritos. And no shade, I love me some Doritos, but I was like, this isn't what I thought it was gonna be, which is the hard part of being 18 and being like, I'm gonna pick the rest of my life. It was an interesting time period, which is why I think I've had this varied path because then I was like, I like science, I like doing the math part. I thought engineering was going to be fun. This is terrible. I'm not doing this. UF had just started this track that was basically being a front end engineer and UX professional all at once. But like I had gotten too far down one degree path and they like to churn you out factory style. So they didn't let me switch to that major, which was a very new major. And so I was like, I guess I like art too. So then I went and got this graphic design degree that was meaningless at the end of the day in some ways. But then I stitched together a career that was very much on track with this brand new major offering that I wasn't allowed to participate in back in the day. But I had that sort of feeling, Nick, of I was like, Dorito dust is not, that is not going to make me a happy lady.
Yeah, I remember I did some research on advanced fluorination compounds. That was like my one big chemical research paper that I probably have a small published title on. But I was just like, why are we doing this? And they're just like, because it's what they give us the money to do. That was the answer. And that's just always the answer. So not for me.
Yeah, I seriously considered going into academics full time, but it's very competitive. You have to, as he was saying, you have to research or write whatever is going to bring you to the top. I think many professors seemed to get more and more jaded about this, that whole higher education world. So I didn't end up doing that, but it would have been fun. I would have loved to be a lifetime student.
So I
Uh,
assume that no one else graduated in 2008, where there was this little financial crisis.
Time
So
to
most
graduate.
people, I think the folks who, a lot of folks, probably about half of the folks who
It's
had jobs lined up, end up not even getting to start. So I actually moved to California from North Carolina, and just kidding, I work a temporary customer service job,
I
and
got
then
very excited all of a sudden. I was like,
yeah,
where have I seen you?
and
I
uh,
needed to find the B movie he was in
yeah,
so
Oh
bad.
yeah.
um,
IMDb.
I some of the other temporary seasonal customer service workers were also actors who also would not be found on IMDb. This is mean, but most of the actors in LA don't actually get any work. But anyway, so that was kind of my first 6 months, and I think they discovered I could. I think no one knew how to do Excel, and they're like, "Yeah, we've been asked to do this Excel project from somewhere above." And I'm like, I guess I can do it. So yeah,
Yeah.
that was helpful.
Underestimate the ability to just do a little Office. MS Office has opened doors for everybody.
Proficient in Microsoft Office is a default thing that everyone should have on their resume. One thing I do want to ask, a little bit different from what we've talked about, but I think it still lends to this topic, is a lot of what you guys have discussed is becoming disillusioned with maybe a field that you were interested in, or maybe something that you thought it was going to be like this. It is absolutely not like this. I don't want to discover new powders for Doritos. And maybe when, as you guys operate your companies, like there are some of those things where you're like, you get in, like dive into that. You're like, oh, I suspect it's going to be just like this. This is what I've seen from maybe colleagues who have worked in those departments. And I suspect that either it's all sunshine and rainbows, or maybe you're like, oh, actually, this is like a little bit more straightforward than I expected it to be. I'm just wondering if there's any certain departments that you walked into thinking this should be, I have a very preconceived idea of what this should be, and maybe it absolutely wasn't that. Does that question make sense?
like, what do you like the business itself or like a role or what?
Like sales, you're like, maybe you haven't done sales before. You're like, oh, I'm gonna like tiptoe into sales, get a sense of what the work is that they do there. And then you're like, oh, this is way more intense than I thought it'd be. Or it's a certain aspect to sales that I totally neglected.
I definitely can say that I had a naivety towards just paid marketing. I genuinely thought that just throwing money at Google Ads, click marketing, and you could just drive whatever channel of traffic just by turning a knob, and it would just be like that easy. Like we can just get this product ready, get this funnel ready, and then people will just come in. And it's a much more elegant art to getting all of the pieces together to actually get that top of funnel traffic in is certainly something that I was naive to coming in. I really thought it was just going to be like if you build it, they will come, or you can just pay to make them come. And it's a completely different game than I thought it would be. So that's definitely the one that I can say has caught me off guard initially. With the effort, it made me have a lot more respect generally for the sales and marketing people that can reliably get leads and good value out of the spend that you are doing in these things. Because it is really easy just to light money on fire into the click ads.
that is definitely true. I think marketing in general is just more complex. Sales and marketing is just more complex than expected. There's a lot of infrastructure even to set up beforehand, which is technical, but if you don't do it and you throw your money out, you may have no idea why it failed or why it worked or if it worked. So there's that aspect to it. And then there's all the different channels you can address and all the different subtle levers to pull. I have been, I think, surprised by the amount of complexity on all the different facets that are involved in marketing and sales. It changes so much. Things that worked like 3 months ago suddenly don't work anymore, according to people. And you just have to flex with that, which is fine, but it's interesting because there's not any specific playbook you can necessarily rely on, which, as I've already mentioned, might not be my favorite thing in the world.
It is
Yeah.
also, I think, an interesting kind of field because so many people not just have preconceived notions, but I think even approach it differently. Where I think for some companies, you're trying to put dollars in and get dollars out, and the hardest part there is measuring are you getting dollars out because like you guys mentioned, it's not just a one-to-one because the benefit could come in so many different ways. In other places, they think about it more as almost like a cost center where it's go make sales a pretty deck is the joke, where it's more of something that we need to do to have a brand, but some people wouldn't count on marketing to have that same level of ROI than I think all of us do. And I think it also just depends on, that's why it's tricky. It depends on the audience, depends on the product, all that stuff. Yeah, you're basically trying to control people from afar without knowing exactly what they're doing. And we know people are odd birds, all of us.
That's for sure. I think looking back over spans of years, I think the biggest thing that I had to learn was that more resources and more money does not necessarily mean that you're going to succeed or put out better work faster, which I think was a pretty big learning as I was transitioning years ago out of IC roles and into leadership roles. And then I made leap from startup world into more established tech companies. And so it was surprising. My instinct was like, oh, there's so much more money here. We've got everything. We've got like salad bars on 3 floors and all of this other stuff. Like, absolutely, we're going to crush it and we're going to move. But this probably ties into my like comment earlier about like squishy people things. That was a little bit surprising to me because I thought that we were all going to just be like working extra hard and doing extra awesome and getting stuff out there and not really thinking about the part where like it would all become kind of political warfare at a certain point after there's like enough money and enough on the line and enough visibility that like what you're doing and the nature of your job changes, even though on the surface what you thought or something different. And then I grew over time to eventually like the biggest team I ever led was 250 people. And I was interim CTO as well as like product and operations and a bunch of stuff. And that was at Vox Media for a period of time. And that was just like the least happy I think I've ever been, not because the company was not good, which it was, but like that role was so far away from going in, getting stuff done and understanding like the fun problems, which was the opposite of what I thought it was going to be as I was like kind of career climbing in previous roles. And I think that was like a point maybe like 4 or 5 years ago at this point that I was like, what I really prefer is being back close to tinkering and like messing around in the system and seeing what's going on. So I think, yes, like marketing never goes the way that you think it's going to go. People don't buy your product the way that you think it's going to happen. You can't just turn on the fire hose. But I think my biggest learning was like the level at which I really like to operate. And I think the amount of cash pouring in, almost I'd rather not go to a place that's like super well funded and cash is a flowing and there's tons of people anymore at this point because it felt harder to do interesting work, which was really the opposite of what I had imagined when I was just starting out. So I think that was an interesting learning, but I think it's all good because then you get more data points about like where you like to work, what you like to learn, the environment that you want to be in, and the problems you're comfortable solving versus the ones you're just absolutely not. So I think that was like the biggest, ooh, this is not what I thought it was, meta learning of my career.
Jen, would you say it was a lot of levels of bureaucracy that kind of made it unpleasant, or would you say that it was?
No. I think it's sure there's bureaucracy, but I think there's also just um like competition and like political sort of infighting. So you get, which is my way of describing it. I'm sure like others would describe it differently who enjoy that sort of environment, to be fair. But I think it's like a lot of focus on politicking and influence and ownership versus we're all here to solve an interesting problem. And I think that felt really different to me in a way that I wasn't expecting as I was coming up. I had 3 people on my team here, and I had 12 people on my team here. If I had 200 people, imagine what could happen. And then you spend most of your time dealing with people's infighting with each other and arguments and the hopes and dreams of your direct reports rather than the work itself, which I'm happy to do to a point, but like 200 people large feels too far away from the
You
fun.
become a work therapist for 250 people.
You're a work therapist, and then you are constantly shielding all these people from above. And yeah, it's a lot to track. That's not the fun part of the job, I think, for me.
Yeah, there's a strong difference between like people facing roles and internal like people roles
Yeah.
of being able to like deal with your reports and everything like that. Has that been like also like a surprise for Jess, Nick, Shrey? I don't know if you guys have found that to be a bit of a surprise for the people side of things and the effort that gets put in there.
My team is small to the point where I've always managed teams of about this size, so I haven't gotten to the scale of Jen, but even listening to that sounds taxing. It frustrated when I have to answer just 15 emails a day. Like 15 emails a day is about my cap, and that seems like you're before coffee is done
Oh, yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's never over. And you spend all your time in meetings rather than the work. Like now, my calendar is so beautiful. I have large chunks of time for like deep focus work. I go offline on Slack. It's fantastic. I think, and maybe that's like the common thread amongst all of us here, right? Like all of us are like, I like to analyze things and take them apart and like all of that stuff. And it's really hard to do. And it's maybe a different personality type. And I think like maybe that's like the common thread amongst like this sort of like level and size of business in a way.
Yeah, I think once you get to that layer of abstraction where you're just delegating instead of like hands-on anything, then you've lost. I feel like I need to have my hands getting a little bit dirty every day. And if I was ever just in a solid block of meetings, just telling other people where to get their hands dirty, I would feel a little disconnected from the product.
Another thing I wanted to ask you guys about, we talked a little bit about what are things that you've been disillusioned with, what are things that you found like you didn't really enjoy doing, for just blind spots of things that you have to do. There's always going to be some work that you may not have as much of a background on. So, how do you deal with working through problems that rely on maybe context or background that you don't always have? Whether that means relying on colleagues who have a little bit more expertise than you, whether that means educating yourselves. I think that with AI, it's really opened a lot of doors for. I know that there are so many things that I've learned since that I just wouldn't have learned before. And I have a little tutor with me that I can ask questions for all the time and they'll never judge me. Just for curiosity, what are some things that you've been learning?
Podcast guesting.
Me too. What about other things related to the companies?
Oh, you go.
I think one thing, especially if you're, I would say for vertical SaaS, but really for anyone, is there's so much weird stuff that exists in this world where it's like regulations or the way things, like for me, it's in the real estate industry, like just the way things are structured and how people behave, I think is very different from like at my last organization, we were selling to most like YouTubers and creators, and before that, it was like nonprofit development officers. So I think each of those has such a unique spin to it. I think how do you basically have this like knowledge center and then use all the observations and the learnings and the failures to reinforce or validate or change your mind on things? You have compounding growth in your industry knowledge. For me, that's been one of the big challenges and something I focus on trying to learn.
Yeah, I think an interesting thing right now is like I have knowledge of how to work with all the other functions. Many of the functions I've directly managed, but it's been a long time since I have had to burn something to the ground and entirely remake it. And especially on the RevOps and finance side for UserVoice, I've never burned that to the ground and built it back, right? Like I've partnered with people who are like, I know how it's supposed to function when it's functioning well. So I think a couple of things have happened with like my best friend Claude is that one, I'm learning about building that back up from scratch because it was not my historical area of like deep expertise. But then also how to build it back up from scratch and make it less onerous and people heavy than traditionally it's been done. So it's been interesting because I have people who are experts at it on my team, and I have some contract help and then folks that I brought in. But I'm trying to make it more efficient and more lean. I think I've been learning about that and resetting it at the same time, which has been super useful and helpful for my team as I've been able to really be remaking it in a way that is not as expensive, not as costly, not as open to subjective human error, while also like getting an interesting new crash course in like how would you set this up from zero if this company had never existed before, except this company's been around for 15 years. So I think that's been really helpful and really useful to learn like this is how it's set up, but then how do I take that and how do I not make the same mistakes and how do I not make it too expensive and how do I not rely too much on too many people for it, but craft a just right size team and set ourselves up to be able to use better tooling in the environment that we're in right now. So I think that's been really interesting and it's been like a bunch of multifaceted pieces of just learning and building at the same time and making lots of mistakes, but also like being happy about getting to direct this thing in a new direction, even though I would not have thought myself qualified to do that 8 months ago.
It's just the one thing AI just tends to really always do is at this point, Claude is just a bridge builder. If you know what you need on both sides of the piece and you have a structured plan or whatever it is you're doing, but you don't have either like the technical specificities or you just need to examine different avenues to connect A to B, I think that's one of the best things that I found using and leaning on Claude for. I will tend to have my own sort of rigid method that I will lean back onto. I think for technical people, sometimes using Claude as an A/B thought, because without it, I would still probably have a well thought out idea of how to do it. And oftentimes it suggests things that I haven't necessarily thought of. I also say it's really good on keeping on top of all the newest, latest, greatest things. I can't read 1,000 blogs a day, but Claude has suggested certain things that then I go and I read this piece of literature and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't read that. That's a new thing, a new tool that I would use or should use in this given scenario. So it's really more of a like an accelerator for me, and that tends to be the way that I use AI these days.
Pretty much everything I've done apart from engineering is something I had to learn on my own. Really have anyone to lean on. So before AI became really big, that was like taking tutorial courses, doing your own research. Customer service has its own templates, for example. Like, how do you diffuse a situation immediately? And once I figured that out, everything was so much easier. It is actually pretty easy to diffuse a situation. But yeah, doing that kind of research, I mean, there's definitely learning in every step of the way. And then as AI has become more available, definitely allowed me to learn more things more quickly. And I learned about Google Ads. I did a course on it. So I think that was just before AI was really becoming useful in that way. Of course, what I ultimately learned is that Google Ads is not super useful for a very small company that has a lot of keyword competitors. I still have a lot to learn there, and I don't feel as intimidated by it anymore. Like, I feel like I can go do it because I'm gonna have my partner, Claude, to help me along the way and definitely discover things I would not discover doing research on my own because it's just impossible for one person to go out and find out something they don't know they're looking for. You have to know that you need to look for something in order to find it, whereas you can just say, Claude, what are the general best practices in X, Y, and Z? And what does a 3-month go to market plan usually look like? Like, how is this structured? So that is definitely not just an accelerator, but it's an enabler. Like I said, if you don't know what you're looking for, you can Google search all you want, but you're not going to land there necessarily. And I definitely feel more enabled and a bit more confident that I'm going to be able to accomplish things in areas that I don't necessarily have a background in now than I did before. So that is very helpful.
I know we're running up on time here, so I think I might just end it there with everyone being like, yes, we have been using AI to help us build. Everyone's been using it to enable learning. And as usual, we end the episode talking about AI. I just want to thank all the CEOs for giving me their time to just talk and pick their brain a little bit about their background. And hopefully this gave you a little bit more insight into who they are as people. And yeah, thank you guys.
Thanks.